If I'm being perfectly honest, I'm constantly trying to fight the cynic in me. It isn't easy though, especially when taking in the state of the world and my power to influence any of it. And now you might be saying, well, this is an existentially heavy way to start a video about a cartoon. And yeah, I'd much prefer if I didn't feel the need to, but as we come to the final part of this retrospective on one of anime and manga's most influential franchises, it has only become more fitting. Because in 2018, an anime became unavoidable, not only a smash hit in the community, but drawing in just about anyone who had a passing fancy with a medium, forming a perfect storm of a talented studio's first mainstream hit, Netflix binging, and a streak of cynical, hyper-violence catching the eyes of even the biggest influencers. That anime is, of course, the Science Sorrow produced, Masaaki Yuasa directed Devilman Crybaby. When I first began planning this video well over a year ago, I intended to discuss not only Devilman Crybaby, but the manga, grimoire, and the 2004 live-action film. As the scope and perspective shifted and events in the real world took place, it became increasingly clear no piece of Devilman is more relevant today than Crybaby. As a franchise, it has never been that hopeful, and if you look at Crybaby's finale in a vacuum, that doesn't change much. It's a show that begins with arms reaching out for light, cut down by cynical narration, which is rather different in comparison to the typical prehistoric or peeping openers of Devilman so far. And that's because at the crux of it all is empathy. People from different situations reaching out to one another. The cynical Ryo comforts the sad Akira and in return receives the most meaningful human connection of his entire life. Though there is a divide. Akira protects a sickly kitten who Ryo insists is going to die anyway, so they might as well put it out of its misery. But Akira protects the doomed cat with his own body. All the while, even after Ryo puts the feline down, Akira presses his friend as he bawls his eyes out, saying he knows Ryo is hurting too. That's Crybaby in a nutshell, the story of a boy driven by extreme empathy fighting a hopeless fight against someone who sees the hopelessness of a situation and provides a more dark outcome. 10 years on, Akira is now in high school, living with Makimura family, and in the same familiar awkward teen romance he's experienced with Miki in so many other renditions. His life is relatively normal, so are the lives of everyone around him for the most part, though subtle rumblings occur. Notably, this Ryo is very soft, only changing into a more familiar sight upon being possessed by a mon, becoming Of the biggest departures in Crybaby, it's gotta be Miki. She's far from the love interest girl of the past, distinctly her own character, the beating heart of the series really. This time around, she isn't just popular in her own school, but she's a known quantity at least at the national level. A Star Trek athlete on top of being a model. She's a social media icon, which is one of the many ways Crybaby smartly modernizes Devilman, though the ugly side of this all is very much in play, given the sway young folk have over platforms like TikTok, Snapchat, and so on. I sometimes feel very old wondering who in the hell any of these people are on these platforms that garner so much attention from so many, and then find out they're barely in their mid-teens. Such is a daunting proposition, as it not only places a lot of attention on those who may not be ready for it, but creates avenues for predators, which is very much Miki's relationship with the photographer Koji Nagasaki. In every sense of the word, Nagasaki preys upon Miki. It's an uncomfortably real relationship between an older man and a young girl, who, yes, wants recognition, but is so tied up with her own emotions and society at large that she feels lost. Nagasaki is not a character from the original manga, but rather an evolution of the demon Gelmer, who is best known for the often recycled scene of his attack on Miki Makimura while she's in the bath. Given the circumstances of it, it seems only fitting the human who is inhabited by Gelmer be a creep. Miki's relationship with this man is used as an opportunity to define her as more than an actor in the story of Akira's life. She doesn't let Akira's possessive nature control her, instead is driven by a sense of guilt or deep understanding of her fortune in life. As opposed to Nagasaki, who grew up poor and only climbed out of destitution by compromising his dreams to become a journalist. She knows what he is, but she can't help but feel bad for him, even if he doesn't deserve it. It's these sorts of changes that make Crybaby stand out, smartly taking the core ideas displayed in other renditions and fleshing them out, as well as modernizing them. One of my favorite examples of such being the group of street toughs who oppose Akira and Miki at the start, but end up aligning with them before long. In the past, they took on the tone of whatever era the given adaptation took place in. So how do you create these guys for the year 2018? Well, let them be the voice of the marginalized.
金もない学もない先行きすら真っ暗いこの街に生まれ落ちた時点で未来なんてない光はある
Through the musical talents of rappers Ken the 390, Young Days, and beatboxer Afra, the group serve as narrators through the majority of transitions in the world, initially rapping about the trials of growing up poor in a city like Tokyo, then shifting to reflect the times of distrust as the demon invasion builds. Given how platforms like SoundCloud have given rise to young artists, especially rappers, this is such a smart choice. These teens aren't the only addition/change to the cast. One of the most notable is Miki Kuroda, who plays the third wheel of sorts in the friendship that is Miki Makamura and Akira. Her addition is maybe one that leaves longtime fans the most puzzled, given her arc feels largely contained in the grand scheme. Everyone refers to her as Miko for clarity's sake, and her story is largely pushed off to the side. This is, well, because she's someone who's felt pushed off to the side her whole life. She's not the foil to Miki, but rather the thematic antithesis of sorts. The person who sees all the good that girl has in her life and can't help but compare. Her family, the happy home. Meanwhile, Miko lives with her bitter and seemingly abusive mother. The Makimuras have a nice house. The Kurodas are in a rundown apartment tower. Miki's love life has seemingly everything to Miko, the older experienced man and the kind boy who will always be there for her. And Miki overshadows Miko in practically every way at school, being both a national track star and a teen social media idol. Despite all this jealousy, anytime they're together, Miko is kind. Even her design is prototypical, demure and soft-spoken anime girl. I mean, she's literally seen in several parts watering snapdragons, a flower in fiction that often symbolizes an outward appearance of cordiality, but masks the very opposite or deceitful intentions. I adore how their friendship evolves as they realize what divides them with their social status. Kuroda is filled with hatred and jealousy as much as she loves her best friend, and in return, Makimura just accepts all that, is well aware of what she has, what she's been lucky to have, and doesn't blame Kuroda for her anger. Meanwhile, Akira and Ryo's opposites in opposition relationship develops further down a path only hinted at prior. What begins as friendship becomes much more complicated by the end, leaning into the homoeroticism between the two, especially on the end of Ryo, who is just an emotional mess struggling with self-identity. When making statements like demons are incapable of love, even though Akira is half demon. What is arguably the biggest change though is how Crybaby embraces the absurdity of the franchise far better than any other version. In the past, characters would act in peculiar fashion, or not react at all, and it felt like it happened because the plot demanded such. Here though, when Akira just follows along with Ryo after he whipped out a submachine gun, everything around the moment in the plot is letting us know that yes, this is silly, but what matters most is the themes at work. Akira's naive early on, and his character design reflects that. He just sees a friend, and his deep empathy propels him to trust and follow. Tied to this moment in the original manga is of course the weirdly puritanical opinion of sex, drugs, and loud music. Even though it comes off as a bit of a goof, it still doesn't resonate with the overall work. With a simple line, it's a subtle improvement in Crybaby. Ryo says the devil won't show up to a fake place like this before attacking now, suggesting the secrecy and confined space of the party is more important than the party itself. Within a few episodes, it becomes clear how unconcerned Crybaby is with pacing out the plot as it layers on messaging. While Akira's parents are alive, the one episode they appear in just resolves that matter. It's less interested in talking about these specific parents and more so parenthood, employing visual metaphors and motifs aplenty, a central one being the gift of shoes, which serve as an early bonding point for parents and their children as they are taught how to tie their own shoes. This of course feeds back into how Crybaby uses running to express what it means to be human, but we'll save that for later. In episode 6, we finally meet Kota, who we've briefly seen around and talked about as the best high school runner in Japan, and has been under a ton of scrutiny. There's a divide between Kota and his team, which we know the source of from the opening minutes of this episode. Akira senses Kota's pain, walking up to him and telling the bitter boy he knows he's crying inside, and Akira just starts wailing. This scene is interesting because I think a lot of people who take the show far too seriously in the wrong ways say this is laughable or bad. It reminds me heavily of some late scenes from Midsummer in which the Swedish commune has some, real novel ways of empathizing with someone in grief. It comes off as weird and maybe even elicits a laugh or two, but that unease is the point. This is not how humans typically express compassion. But maybe we should be a little bit more like Akira, because our reality is that everyone is afraid to reach out to Kota, and the result is his pain becomes isolation. A fear of who he is and what he's becoming. Akira's manner of telling him he's not alone is odd, but it does ultimately help. I don't take a ton of pleasure in the brutality of any media. Despite being a fan of horror, I still get turned off by works that cross the blurred line in my head. Jurassic World comes to mind as a clear-cut misstep in this regard. The character of Zara has arguably the most dragged out and torturous death scenes in the entire franchise, and it feels like the director is reveling in it. Her greatest crime is that she didn't feel like dealing with the kids her boss pawned off on her. Meanwhile, the main villain dies off screen. Devilman has absolutely taken pleasure in the demise of its human cast, though that's certainly at its worst in the Devil Lady manga. Crybaby doesn't always get this right, it still falls victim to the source material in a lot of ways, but more often than not, I find the gore watchable. And for someone who would feel sorry for the cannon fodder bad guys in a James Bond movie as a kid, that takes a certain balance. Or rather, in this instance, a thematic melding. In a show driven by empathy, me feeling for the random folks being slaughtered is kind of the point. Even if there is some intention of us being visually pleased by these moments. Or for instance, the iconic club scene that takes an artistic approach and goes all out on the psychedelic visuals, which are a mainstay across Yuasa's work. With the evolution of Akira's body in episode 2, the show plays around with the notions of realistic body horror, both tapping into the changes young people undergo at this point in their lives and how scary that can be, but also what it means to suddenly be in possession of a power you don't understand. The type that makes you a danger to those around you, no matter your intentions. Though as mentioned, Crybaby isn't free of the faults Devilman carries at its core. While everyone falls victim to demons in horrific fashion, women seem to get the worst of it, or rather have their deaths far more sexualized. Or they fall victim to tropes like fridging. Given the prevalence of all this raw material, I think it's important for anyone interested in any piece of Devilman media to know what they're getting into, and for the fans of it to understand why this franchise isn't for everyone. There's a scene in a song in Devilman Crybaby that hits me every time. Whether I'm rewatching the series or listening to the soundtrack as I write. In a show filled with excessive gore, violence, sexualization, and a hyper-cynical perspective, none of that is present here. The scene I speak of exists in the wake of such. It also isn't even one of the most well-animated moments. It's a few shots, simple ones of repeating animations, but expertly directed. I love how the placement of it breaks Netflix in such an interesting way. A service that is so obsessed with high-speed marathon consumption of media, where we outright ignore the names of the talented folks responsible for everything on screen. Instead, at the end of episode 9, where all seems lost, we slow down and see what could have been, rather, what should have been. The lives these young people deserved and had stolen from them. A beautiful, intimate moment of vulnerability and tranquility. It's this moment that elicits the most emotional response, because it's a half a century old franchise hitting its zenith. There's still contempt, but contrasted wonderfully with why we shouldn't be merely cynical but angry. Furious in our desire to not give in to the worst of us, because this is the peace we deserve. This is the happy, comfortable life every single one of us should not just have a shot at, but has the right to from birth. When I think about my favorite media, a lot of it has a similar pulse. It's why the end of Nier Automata or listening to the song Weight of the World ruins me in a similar way. Because this mixture of frustration and optimism is me. I've not struggled with this more at any point in my life than the last several months. Where here in the US, an ugly election cycle has proven that no matter how far it feels like we've come, at best we're just going to push for a return of normalcy as defined by the 1990s. But now we've become very aware, as this pandemic has made painfully obvious much of the systems that prop up the countries touted by themselves to be the best in the world are fundamentally broken. Scientifically designed to prioritize the wealth that stays in the hands of the few and damn the lives lost along the way. As someone working in the food industry, as this all unraveled, choices like hiring up in confined spaces, blatantly ignoring recommended gathering sizes as stated by both state and federal governments, not reducing hours, refusing to offer sick leave, or any sort of worthwhile hazard pay, made things very clear. This is a business opportunity for them. It makes the notion that we learn from history in order to not repeat it seem like childish optimism, because I don't always believe we learn in such a linear manner, but rather sometimes we just stumble forward at best. So why bother? Why bother to keep pushing when the opposing forces of the world feel so overwhelming? Because of that feeling at the end of episode 9, because of the mentality Miki brings to running. By our very nature, humans are not designed to be capable runners. So why run? Why does Miki continue to be fueled by empathy in a world where she will never see the benefits of such? And the answer is simple, because you just have to. Even if you can only carry the baton a little further, your only choice is to move forward and pass what little hope you can on. How Devilman Crybaby is unafraid to lean into modern politics, criticize Japan's issues with racism in regards to people of foreign descent or mixed race. How it recognizes that those in power will propagandize against dissenting voices at every opportunity and rally upon the people's fear. And that despite its messaging of empathy, it recognizes there are some who can't be reached. It's for reasons like this, for moments like Miki's message of defiance to how Akira and demons have been painted, how humans are losing trust in one another and succumbing to the worst versions of themselves, that what's most important to humanity on a fundamental level is acceptance and understanding. That's why I believe Devilman Crybaby is the best version of Devilman to date. Thanks for sticking this one out. It's been a weird time to be making videos about anime on the internet. In the grand scheme of things, they kind of seem a little pointless, but writing has actually been a real comfort to me in these times where I just sit inside and look at the news and say, well, this isn't good. I do genuinely hope that you're doing well out there, and that you're staying indoors as much as humanly possible. I know not everyone's so fortunate. And to those who are and can afford to give a little money, maybe I'm not your first choice, there's a lot of better choices, but if you are so inclined, I do have a Patreon. Donating even $1 to that can actually help out a whole lot with these videos, and lets me know that people do genuinely care about my writing. Hopefully I'll have a quicker turnaround with the next video. I'm already well into the script and have consumed the content in question, but you never know with these things. So until then, thank you very much, as always.